You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I got a baby right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am Urza Master, with me as always, Lord Uther, and our recurring host, APC, aka today, Lieutenant Stephen McCaffrey, otherwise known as Bull. Welcome, sir. Welcome. Gentlemen, this is our 32nd episode of the Warp Core podcast. Today, we boldly go to one of the recurring characters of Star Trek, and several recurring tropes of Star Trek. And I have to say, before we even jump into this, I am still, to this day, a little baffled that somehow they tried to make the character in question in episode 6 the recurring villain of the series, because, I gotta be honest, not exactly the strongest villain, but made for some really interesting Star Trek stories, which of course, are pervasive today throughout several subsequent episodes of Star Trek. But without further ado, I want to turn this over to Lieutenant Stephen Bull McCaffrey to give us some background and to, of course, illuminate us on the proceedings of Mudd's Women.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you at home, both here and overseas. Yes, today we will begin with Mudd's Women, first aired on October 13th, 1966. The director was Harvey Hart. He was a Canadian television and film director, most noted for his contributions to Star Trek, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and Columbo. Just one more thing. The story for Mudd's Women was written by the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry. The teleplay was written by Stephen Kendall. This was one of 3 scripts that Roddenberry submitted to NBC after the failure of The Cage. So there were 3 scripts. Once they said, we're not making The Cage, it's too cerebral. He said, fine, I'll give you 3 scripts, and you pick which one we do, since you want to do a second pilot. And those scripts were Where No Man Has Gone Before, Mudd's Women, and The Omega Glory. Now, we all know what happened, that Where No Man Has Gone Before was selected and aired as the second pilot eventually. The Omega Glory, we'll see down the road, way, way down the road. It is the 23rd episode of Season 2. So we'll circle back to that one once we get there. And then we have now Mudd's Women. Roddenberry is credited with the story for this, and Kendall with the teleplay. However, Kendall complained in subsequent years that Roddenberry kept meddling and rewriting him behind his back, which is how Hollywood basically works. But Kendall was no stranger to writing for the small screen. In addition to Star Trek, he contributed episodes of Mannix, Wonder Woman, Adam West's Batman, Lee Majors' The $6 Million Man, and Richard Dean Anderson's MacGyver, the first iteration of that show in the 1980s. But once again, we see, especially in these early episodes of the first season, as the show is still finding its star legs, these are not writers who were all corralled into a room in a writer's room and said, okay, I want you to think, breathe, and eat NCC 1701. These are people with extensive backgrounds in the medium who were sort of called in, sort of as a freelance basis to say, hey, what have you got? What can you do? Can you turn it in by Monday? And to their credit, we see a wide variety of style, tone, perspective, background. In later subsequent seasons, you might see a more consistent writing voice. or voices. But for now, it's just kind of, again, trying to find out what the voice of Star Trek is. And so it's kind of neat that you have novelists and other television writers who didn't do science fiction per se, or playwrights or whomever, sort of all joining into the chorus to try to make this show the indisputable science fiction champ of the late '60s here. Okay, so
smell.
Harcourt Fenton Mudd, I believe that's his full name. He is introduced to us in this tale. He will later appear in I, Mudd, and he will also appear in the animated episode Mudd's Passion, voiced by the same actor who plays him in live action, Roger C. Carmel. I actually was introduced to this character before I tuned into this episode. I first ran across him in some Star Trek comics that were written right around the time of the Kelvin timeline storylines. They went ahead and did some, the comic book publisher, IDW, was doing a Star Trek series to kind of run alongside those films. And they used the Kelvin Enterprise crew members in a variety of storylines, much like you would have found during the Enterprise's 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds and seek out new life and new civilization.
New civilization.
And one of the characters they encountered in the comic was Mudd. And then he was also portrayed in Star Trek Discovery by Rainn Wilson, whom you'll remember from his stellar stint on NBC's sitcom The Office. And that's actually
Galaxy Quest.
And Galaxy. And that's the first time I saw this character in the flesh and blood. And I'll be honest, Rainn Wilson plays it much differently than Roger C. Carmel does. And I liked Rainn Wilson. No offense to Roger, but Rainn Wilson played him as a guy who would stab you in the back one scene and lock hands with you and say, "We're a team," in the very next breath. And he had an air of menace. And to be frank, they gave him better lines during his episode, his little mini arc that he had in Discovery. So I do encourage Star Trek fans, if you haven't checked out his portrayal, it's definitely worth a look if you're a fan of the character, fan of the show, because he elevates the origins of the character and makes it his own. And as you might imagine, he does a very good job with it. All right, so we mentioned that Roger was Mudd. We also should mention Mudd's women. We had Eve, the lead woman who gets the most screen time in development. She wore red. And her name was actually Eve McCurran. We have Ruth, my favorite. She wore green, and her name was Maggie Threat. And we have Magda, and she wore purple, and that was Susan Denberg. So those were the Mudd's women, kind of dressed like I Dream of Jeannie. I guess that was a thing going around in the late '60s, but that was how they were portrayed. All right, so let's start the discussion here with some observations and some little notes here. First of all, I'm so glad they got rid of the creepy co-helmsman next to Sulu. And by creepy, I mean he just looks off, right? Like I never want to face shame anybody, but like he looks like something's happened to him basically every time. Like I'm not getting emotion or human characters. I'm like, oh, that guy looks weird. All apologies.
It's so true.
To his estate. That actor is Jim Goodwin, and he's playing this helmsman named Farrell. And I don't know how long we're going to have crewman Farrell, but we've seen him once or twice now on the early episodes, and I'm just like, whoa. So, anyways.
That's a great way to put it, too.
Right.
Whoa.
Whoa. He's very intense looking, and he's not doing anything. Also, I don't know if Uhura hadn't done laundry, but it was distracting to see that most of the bridge crew was wearing yellow. And I'm so used to her wearing red with Montgomery Scott and those unfortunate crewmen who keep beaming down on away missions. But in this one, maybe she just didn't care. But she's just like, she's in the same yellow tunic as Sulu, as Farrell, as Kirk. And it just, visually speaking, it threw me off for a second. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on in here? And Uhura was kind of pouty this episode. Like, this was one of the first episodes where instead of getting any sort of semblance of her as a character, her primary goal was to put her hand to her ear and say, ship's transmission coming in, Captain. Like, this clearly was not an Uhura forward episode. And that's fine, because you're going to get a bunch of those. But this was one of the early ones where she really just did her job and wasn't given much in terms of that there. It's the first time that Bones on camera articulates that he doesn't trust transporters, which will become an ongoing
trope.
Yes, a trope, if you will. And then, I mean, the lithium versus dilithium crystals, we don't have all the hours in the day to discuss why they went from lithium, which was a Nirvana trope of its own, to dilithium. I assume the physics will explain themselves, but in this episode, they need lithium in the worst way. And the only way that the 1960s could articulate that is that they turn the lights off on the set. In terms of, like, we've lost power, Captain, and they literally, the lights went out there. So that's how they were handling that. I think this might be the first episode uncredited that Majel Barrett is the computer voice, and if it is, if I'm correct on that, they're still figuring out how to write for the computer, because she kind of does not compute, kind of a sentence structure and grammar, and in subsequent series episodes and so forth, particularly when she was doing it for Next Gen and DS9 and Voyager, like, it's much more of a smooth, authoritative, like, shield's down to 40%. But here they were still trying to figure out how to write an artificial life form. More on that in the next episode that we'll be covering. I like seeing Bones McCoy flirting, because I think DeForest Kelley, just that Southern gentleman, and when he encounters Mudd's women, it's just that smile and like, well, hello. Like, and then when she starts setting off the bioscanner, why are you doing that? Like, I thought it was a nice moment for DeForest Kelley. Like, it truly just, again, it's not going to advance the plot or whatever, but you like him, and you like his reactions, and it felt very authentic to me. So that was a nice moment there. By the way, who could just walk into the captain's quarters? Like, he walks in and there's Eve, like, lying on the bed. Captain, I've been waiting for you. Like, do they not lock their quarters in? Is it just wave a hand in front of a scanner? That bothered me. Like, not to the point where I was like, I'm turning this off, but I just felt like Kirk's quarters, probably, you're the captain. You should probably at least, do not disturb sign on there. If anybody can just,
especially for Captain Kirk.
Exactly. Like, when Spock wants to come in, come. I feel like there should be some sort of, like, Ring doorbell type thing there that you can at least do that there. There was a nice interchange between Shatner and DeForest Kelley. They were interpreting things on the bridge, and Kirk says something, and McCoy says something back, and Kirk's like, I asked you first. And I thought that was a nice little, like, I asked you first, delivered in a very Shatner way there. And then when they beam down to the mining planet, because again, your storyline is that here's this swashbuckling smuggler, bon vivant, and he's arranged for these women to be basically selling them into slavery, aka marriage, to lonely men in the galaxy. And so they beam down to these hard, grizzled lithium miners, and it's like the world's worst cocktail party. Like, it's with the 60s lighting and like the rock walls and granite, I just felt sad. I was just like, this is, keeping in the storyline.
The whole thing's cringeworthy.
I just felt sad for them. I'm like, this is no life for me. So, and then they're taking drugs, which obviously in the '60s was a little bit more permissible. They're taking drugs to stay pretty, and their beauty is only skin deep. And then when Eve wants to stay plain, she runs off into the dilithium storm. We get a Kirk shouting out, "Eve!" which was fun. And then they go up to try and scan the surface to find her. And he yells at Scotty. And again, this is not something that you see a lot of, particularly in the big screen franchise and the like. He's like, he snaps at Scotty, like, "What would you do?" And Scotty just kind of nods. And then Kirk takes a moment, composes himself, comes back and says, "Yeah, I'm sorry." And then Scotty again nods. So I like to see that. I like to see a little conflict, but they fixed it together real quick there. And then we cut away to basically the thematic message of this show, this episode, where she's plain and trying to take care of the man presumably to be her husband, and he puts on the sexist, misogynist, like, "Well, I could have made my own dinner." And then it kind of breaks through. And then I think the best twist, obviously, even for its time, the idea that she took a placebo and it was all inside her all along. And then he's like, "Well, wait a minute. If you can do that, then yeah, let's." So, and
you can stay here now.
Right. For some
that
reason,
old dumb dude trope.
Yeah, for some reason she looked like Frances McDormand, like plain, which is not. I mean, there was when they were on the
Very
ship.
pleasant.
Right, when they were on the ship and they're all like hags and they've got that too much eye makeup and that was a little grotesque and overdone. But like, I'm totally happy with her not taking the drugs based on what was going on in the cavern there and so forth. And so those are my observations. We'll get to my opinions about how I felt about that at the end. But gentlemen, I kind of leave you with this in the sense that Mudd, and again, I'm thinking of the Rainn Wilson portrayal, he played him as actually villainous and willing to, again, like, throw anybody over the bus or overboard just to save his own skin. And I think that's what they were trying to kind of go for here, but I don't know that they hit the landing, because I never really got a sense of menace. And I wanted to have you guys, your impression of him, based on, you may have been already familiar with the character, but I don't know if it was in performance by Roger or if it's just that they didn't write it so that he would, I expected, and I think he references at one point, "I'll be the captain of the ship." And I didn't quite get, he never got out of second gear for me as a, quote, villain. I mean, he was a scoundrel, and he was, he had a certain larger-than-life persona, granted. But I never got the sense that Kirk and them were really sort of in jeopardy of, the ship will be hijacked, or he'll pull a phaser on Kirk. And, so your thoughts on Harry Mudd and how he was portrayed in this incarnation?
Well, I think he's supposed to be more of a scumbag. I feel like more than anything else, right? Like, and more on the salesy side, and not that salespeople are scumbags, but in any profession, right? You've got good people, you have bad people, or you have sneaky people, and I think he's supposed to be the sneaky scumbag type of guy, obviously, that's looking to enrich himself off of other people. But to go back to something that both of you were kind of saying or alluding to, and it's something I've been noticing, with all of the shooting, it seems to me, and I think, they're, Bull, I think you brought this up before, that they were shooting episodes out of sequence, and I think that's why you're running into the costume issues because of that, maybe even ranks of people because of that. You can also see them establishing norms and verbiage, right? They couldn't, the lithium crystal to dilithium crystal, or there was something, warp factors and warps, and I mean,
Deflector screen versus shields.
So that's stuff they're trying to, so we're trying to establish norms for a show,
right?
That will eventually happen, and I think, to me, that's something I like to see, I guess, with something I love so much. How did that happen, or to see this evolution at an older age and understand it. With all that being said, this goes back to multiple things, and multiple times we've talked about it. You didn't have to establish any norms in a sense between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and that's part of that. You know, just they're all on the same page from day one, and I think that lends to the strength of the show. They don't have to figure out their relationships, or the relationships of their characters on the show, which I think is something that helped it along. And even though there have been issues with Shatner and different actors over the years, if Shatner wouldn't have played the character the way he did, or probably acted the way he did, people would not have loved Kirk the way they do. Because I love the point you brought up, which is actually something I had written down. He yelled at Scotty, but he did something I don't think you see a lot of leaders that were males back then do, and he apologizes. And that caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting him to apologize. I was expecting him to gloss over it. But that's what makes people love you as a leader, is that you acknowledge your mistakes, right? And that's something he does. So he can be the strong, tough guy, but he can realize that he's made a mistake and ask for forgiveness in a sense. And I think that's a big deal.
I think so too, and I think there's a respect level, and you got to remember too that James Doohan was older than most of the cast, so I think in a way, and I'm sure it was scripted, but I think in a way there's a respect level difference between the two, and I think Shatner may have almost felt like, ooh, it was kind of one of those moments, like, just from a characterization standpoint, he kind of blows up at him and then owns it. But part of that, I think, playoff is that Shatner and James Doohan kind of had that, like, ooh, hey, sorry, man. That came off harsher than maybe the character should have. And it ended up being very authentic. And that's one thing about this episode that always struck me is the interactions are very, like, you can tell some of it's very on the nose, right? The
Natural.
misogynist dialogue is like real heavy on the nose, and of course this is women's empowerment era, so yeah, you're gonna get that. However, I think there was also some real authentic, like, wow, I'm like I think of Eve and the miner in question, I forget his name. That was a real kind of authentic moment between the two, where they're like, it's that give and take that you'd see on a sitcom in the same era, where there's sort of this understanding of, like, kind of the dopey husband figure and the subtly smarter than him wife, and you get a lot of that in, like, 90s television. Like, this is one of those moments that I think inspired generations of TV again. And I thought that was really cool. Like, there's so much about this that it is kind of cringeworthy, but where I think some people might get hung up these days on the cringy parts of the show, there's a lot of redemption too. And I think, like you said, I don't think Mudd, the classic Mudd, is really menacing. He comes off to me almost like a Dom DeLuise type. Like, he's kind of goofy in a way.
That's great.
You know what I mean? Like, he's sort of a sleaze, goofy sales guy who definitely has, like, ulterior motives and, like, a hidden streak of danger to him, which I think is actually very clever as opposed to the Rainn Wilson portrayal, which I respect it for what it is, but I think that's a little too on the nose for me. Like, I prefer to see kind of it's kind of goofy and it doesn't feel menacing, but really kind of like a Khan in Wrath of Khan. He's very villainous, very menacing, but he's also, like, Shakespearean, and relishes in the moment. And it's the same thing for Mudd. He relishes the moment, and while he's menacing, it's so downplayed that he comes off goofy, and that to me is actually kind of enjoyable for a villain. Although it doesn't quite make him the story arc villain that I think they wanted him to be. He's almost just, like, too goofy to be, like, taken seriously. But I love that. Like that's something that they do so well on Star Trek. I mean, without Mudd, you don't have Garrick, and Garrick is one of my favorite Star Trek characters
Yes.
of all time.
Yes.
And it's almost the exact same portrayal
Yeah, that's a
in a way.
I think it's interesting that Kendall had written for Batman because while I don't think this reaches that high level of camp with the Penguin or the Batman villains, I think I can see the impulse to try to write him bigger. I guess like make it really expressive, and I think that
flamboyant.
yes, flamboyant, and I
Flamboyant,
think that tracks with how he would if that was another show that he was contributing those to because the Adam West Batman was just it's cartoon, it's
I was
comic
gonna
book.
say
Nothing is
very similar. Yeah.
right. So I feel like this is kind of like maybe like diet villain, a diet Batman villain, if you will. And I mean, I can see that. I just thought, I thought it was a little hammy. Obviously, I didn't dislike it, but I was just waiting. We've seen in the early episodes, we've seen like the monsters, the salt vampires who want to take over the ship, and Charlie X, and I just felt like, Kirk pretty much can, get this guy. He's not going to be overmatched by Harry Mudd. So, oh, and the trial scene, which, again, the
Trope.
right. I mean, sitting there, and that's the Majo Barrett, incorrect. Like that was fun. It may have gone on for like a beat too long, but that was fun to, sitting there saying, "I'm so and so." No, you're not. Okay, fine. I'm this guy. But I've got my license. No, you don't. So that was kind of fun there. I'd also be curious about the effects because we talk about how Paramount and the Star Trek they digitized the FX shots and updated them. I'm honestly curious. I'd like to see the original Mudd to see the ship zooming through the asteroid belt and then exploding and so forth. I mean, I'm just curious because I thought it looked pretty sharp in this remastered version, but I'd be curious what they were able to accomplish in the 60s. I'd have to try and find some clip somewhere of the non cleaned up special effects for that sequence because that's a pretty cool sequence when it's like veering left and right and they're getting pulled apart and beam them up, beam them out. So, but I'd like to
And that's
see.
something that I've got the VHS releases of the original series, and that's something that if you're subscribing here on Pending Rebrand to stay up to date with the Warp Core podcast, we could do a live show watching these original broadcast versions, and just to compare the effects. I mean, again, Star Trek trope, extend the shields. First time that's happened
Oh, there you go.
on a Star Trek episode, and that becomes such like they did it. They've done it multiple times in every subsequent Star Trek series and in a couple of the movies too, I think. And it's such an iconic thing to put your own lives in danger to save questionable others, right? I mean, we see it in Generations where I think they did it the best. Where like they're riding into this rift to try and save these refugees, and well, of course, zap goes Captain Kirk. But that's it's just such a this is an unexpectedly foundational episode. And we talk about this first season. We'll talk about it over and over again. How these lay the foundation for everything we know and love about Star Trek. You would not expect Mudd's Women, which title alone makes you think like, how is this an important episode for the series? But it hits on like virtually everything that Star Trek is going to do over and over and over again forever. And despite all these being tropes, they always can be refreshed and made to feel new and fun. And that's Harry Mudd too. How many Star Trek characters in the future, not just Garrick, but how many of them are some version or borrow something from Harry Mudd? I mean, you could even argue that Q is a Harry Mudd type. And that's powerful. And I don't think it's just how the character is purely written. I think it's the acting, that sells the characters. It's like we see in Strange New Worlds. They're extrapolating a lot of the characterization and the the version we get on screen to sort of develop these storylines that we see in the future. And I mean, I got to say, with this episode, I'm very pleased. You know, I mean, it does feel dated. I mean, it does feel of the era, but it also, with time and age now and perspective, it feels really like almost like warm and homey in a way, where it's like this is Star Trek. This is the kind of episode I would love to turn on at like 6 a.m. on a Saturday when I'm a little kid, and it's the only thing on the 3 channels that are coming across the airwaves. This would be something fun that you could sit there and eat your cereal to, and you know, it's a little risque, but it's also a little bit informative, and you know, pushes sort of the boundaries of the era and boundaries of, you know, what you can do on television. So you know, again, I could toot the horn of the original series all day. I don't need to get too deep into it, but I really love this episode, and all the things it does. Even though, you know, Uhura is relegated to a ear holding, I have a transmission for you, sir. I think we still get enough of all the other characters that it just feels right. You feel at home in this episode.
And Farrell is still creepy. So, anyways,
Yes.
any last thoughts, Lord Uther, before we segue?
No,
Okay.
no, I think that sums it all up.
Well, then let's turn our attention a week later to October 20th, 1966. Getting close to Halloween now, folks. And let's find out what little girls are made of. The director of this episode was James Goldstone. We have seen his work before. He, in fact, did Where No Man Has Gone Before. So the second pilot. So this was his next episode following that. And it was written by Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch, who was a protege of H.P. Lovecraft. And there were references throughout this episode to Lovecraft, including the old ones. And apparently he had a thing for hexagons or that shape, because all the doorways on the underground laboratory were designed with Lovecraft in mind. So if you're a fan of Cthulhu and the like, this is probably for you. But Bloch, who wrote, you know, a prolific author and worked in television and film to some degrees, but was really you know, putting stuff with stories, short stories written for the pulp magazines of the time and so forth. He's best known as the author of Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock legendarily turned into the Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh thriller. So that is his claim to fame. And again, not the in-the-room Star Trek writer for the whole season. Just let's bring in this novelist and science fiction writer and see what he's got. We're going to talk about this sequence in just a moment, but in the famous or infamous transforming Captain Kirk into his double sequence, William Shatner was shaved because Gene Roddenberry insisted that Captain Kirk would not be hairy. So that's him. And he is
Ooh.
yes, he is shaved like a baby's bottom, and apparently he went commando. That was Shatner and
Oh my!
yes, exactly.
Wow.
On that set there, yes. So supporting him in this episode, Michael Strong played Dr. Corby. Ted Cassidy played the otherworldly-looking Ruck. And Sherry Jackson played Andrea, and we could spend 40 minutes talking about Andrea. She required an on-set coordinator to ensure that there were no flashes of side boob or any other in that costume, which, again, like I said, I hate to sound like a 50-year-old man, but she was eye candy in the best sense. No need to objectify her. She also turns in a fine performance. But wow, when I say Andrea, she definitely took the cake there. So, all right.
Trope alert.
So there
We need a sound
were
effect for that.
there were some.
Yeah, we do.
I think in the opening, I think in the sort of the teaser, there was some James Goldstone did some interesting things. There were like zoom close-ups, and it's not a visual language that overall Star Trek like used over and over, but it was almost like they were flashing in on Uhura and Christine and so forth. Like the camera, there were actual movements in there. Usually on these shows, it's a pretty static setup. You know, the camera's locked down. You've got your performances happening in front of the lens, et cetera, et cetera. But this one felt like a little, and they hadn't invented the Steadicam yet, but this one was a little more, you know, again, 60s filmmaking. All of a sudden, we're like, whew. And you know, the audience, it's supposed to, you know, give you a little sense of tension or urgency or so forth. But you notice it. When you're noticing the camera move, it's calling attention to its own structure and format. That was interesting. I don't know if we're going to see a lot of that throughout the show. My guess is we won't. But it did do this here. This is our first. I think when they were attacked on previous episodes, they might have been wearing blue, science blue and medical blue. I want to say that this is the first that stands out to me as the red shirts go tumbling down and getting knocked off, and which became trope, a classic.
Trope alert.
There you go. And it was interesting again to me, like, you don't see anything, it's not violent, it's very safe PG stuff here. But again, the willingness to just casually murder supporting characters in the course of the storyline. You know, one guy falls to his death off camera with a no, and the other one gets his neck turned by Ruck. In the same underground caverns, they probably just reused from the previous episode for the mining colony. You know, why not save a buck here? In these granite caves. And again, you've got to love the late 60s sort of like mood lighting. It's a little bit like there's like magenta and blue and green, and it's otherworldly, I guess. The color palette is otherworldly. But it's like, it's telling the audience, this is otherworldly. This doesn't look like what you'd normally see on Earth. Look, it's sort of magenta and fuchsia. And so that's always fun, you know, kind of a thing. Either that or it's a bad hallucinogenic trip there.
Visual storytelling at its 60s finest.
Show me, don't tell me. I believe this is the first mention on camera of George Samkirk, which is a nice little, again. And Strange New Worlds has done much better by actually personifying and giving him flesh and bones. So once again, you can see they were paying attention there.
Speaking of,
right?
He's going to have to get married and have 3 kids at some point, right? Because wasn't that what was mentioned in this episode? He's married with 3 kids.
Right.
So somewhere at Strange New Worlds is going to have to get him a love interest.
Right.
They're listening.
They
always
are.
on.
They are. They love
Listening.
the Warp Core podcast. So please subscribe if
Who
you
doesn't?
Drop us a comment if you work for them, because we're looking for jobs.
I mean, you can buy into this anytime you want for a cool 5 to 10 million. We're here for you, Paramount. Just know that
We're
we're
listening.
here for you.
I did
Disney.
have my first Mystery Science Theater moment in this episode when they turned Kirk for a double. They strap him to a circular swing, and the Dr. Corby tells Christine, "Don't worry, look at your captain. He won't be harmed." And then they start to rotate him at a high velocity of speed, and all I could think of is in Dr. Corby's voice saying, "He won't be harmed. He'll just be dizzy," as they like. But when we're done, we get 2 Kirks again, and we just saw that in The Enemy Within. I liked the reveal of which Kirk was which when after the experiment they sit down and have a meal together, and non-good Kirk says androids don't eat. Real Kirk battles Ruck. And then it gets his life saved by him, thanks to Christine's fast thinking of you must obey my orders no matter what. But he grabs a very phallic rock, and I hate to point this out, but I could not tear it. I mean, it looks like it when he puts his hands around it, and when he tears it off the ceiling and is holding it. I'm sorry. I went there, and you'll go there too if you see it, and Google me.
I almost took a picture of it and sent it to you guys.
Yes. That was a very unfortunate choice by the set designers in that moment.
Yes.
Again, completely unintentional, I hope. But yes, that was my second Mystery Science Theater moment there. But really, the thing we need to talk about here, you can have fun with all of those elements. It's this idea of androids, right? And that's kind of what sets this show apart from the other shows that we've seen so far in this season. I mean, is this not the birthplace where we'll later get Noonien Sung? You know, Data's father. Are these the first Datas, right? I mean, in their crude sense. And then, Roddenberry and them revisit this in DC Fontana years later at Encounter at Farpoint. Like, do you guys feel that this is the episode that, planted the seed, the space seed, that would later lead to a whole, different set of rules and so forth? Like, I feel like this is the episode. It's a shame that the twist, and it's a good twist, it's a shame that we've seen so much come in its wake and aftermath. I mean, Ian Holmes' revelation in Ridley Scott's Alien comes to mind. Like, it's a shame because it's a great reveal, but it would have been a fantastic reveal on October 20th, 1966, whereas we've watched 30 or 40 years of television, Buck Rogers, Star Trek, Star Wars, where it's like
Twilight Zone,
where it's like, wait a minute, he's really an android. I mean, can you still love me, Christine?
You are a robot.
Right. Let's talk about androids and their relation to the Star Trek universe. And like I say, basically this is ground zero, I guess. Even if they were able to refine the concept and make it more human down the road, like this is probably their first baby step towards that. And I invite you to opine.
I'm gonna take it a step I'm gonna kind of take it a step further. The one reason why Star Trek is loved so much is their vision of what the future is, and how many times have, in real life, as the youngins would say, IRL, people have taken Star Trek ideas and made them into real things. Think of Next Generation with them on the pad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an iPad. They've taken those things, and so I also think this episode holds up incredibly well to today, because isn't this the argument right now about AI? My students and I have had several very deep conversations about AI and what the possibilities are, and you kind of see a little bit of well, I'm sure the thought of something like this was around during this time period and before. Star Trek obviously just kind of, makes that theory kind of rise to the top, and it especially during a time period where there was no chance for them to see something like that. And let's be honest, did we really even think we were going to see something like that? I mean, maybe with Terminator, like that movie being out there, or the possibility of it happening. Within the next 1 to 3 years, AI is going to be able to think on its own, allegedly. That's a big deal too. So the issues then we're seeing come into play now, which again, that's the vision of Star Trek and why people love it so much, the ideas and the hope that's behind it. With all that,
that's the beauty of it. Oh, not to cut you off. Sorry about that. And that's really the beauty of it, because bear in mind, when this episode comes out, this is pre-personal computer. So this is pre War Games computer panic, where people really thought, those first 4-bit computers and 8-bit computers were going to suddenly leap into robots and androids, like we see in Star Trek. This is where this all starts. Because as soon as you get personal computers that can do things like freak phones, like Commodore VIC-20s, Commodore 64s, very early on, you get these ideas that, well, the next step is there's going to be completely artificial people, like there was in Star Trek. And sure enough, they just lean heavy into that moving forward. But that's absolutely where a lot of you know, future nerds get their ideas is these original Star Trek episodes. I mean, there are literal scientific like proofs and theorems and molecules and stuff that are named after Star Trek because it was Star Trek. Star Trek predicted this. They came up with the verbiage, and we just discovered it into reality. And AI is certainly, I for one welcome our AI overlords of the future because I love AI. I send you guys AI stuff all the time. I have
Yes, you do.
so many pictures of fake celebrities making cheese sandwiches because for whatever reason that's my favorite thing to ask AI to do is, hey, can you show me David Duchovny making a cheese sandwich? And then it's like this gigantic cheese held up by one hand of David Duchovny who's kind of looking off in the wrong direction and his eyes are going like that. But I love it. I'm just enamored. And that's incredibly basic AI. That's like not even quite Android artificial intelligence, but you know, it's amazing the things that we're able to do because shows like this inspired people. You know, how many of the physicists of today working at Fermilab started out reading Ray Bradbury or watching Gene Roddenberry television or The Twilight Zone? And that was their inspiration as a tot to come out and get a degree in applied sciences and literally make things reality. I mean, I don't know if y'all remember, but in the 90s, they were working on transporter technology, and they were successful. I think a lot of people forget about this. They were successful in transporting photons,
Yep.
which is still mind-numbing to me. And this is with the technology of the 90s. You know, the supercomputers of the 90s are far less powerful than pocket calculators of today. Like that's what's truly amazing. And really, I mean, just look what we can produce today: tiny books, tiny books.
Anyway,
And but you know, that's the coolest thing about this is like you know we talk about how this is a foundational type episode, right? For all of the future tropes we're going to see, and all the amazing technology we get from this Star Trek show, but they can't make a webcam that stays in focus.
I was about to say that. Beat me to it.
But yeah, I totally agree. This episode holds up in remarkably well. Even the falling against the wall, you know, acting like it's overly dramatic, right? But it's played up in a way that's, you know, stage theatrical because it conveys that sense of, you know, small screen intensity that you don't typically get on a Star Trek show. And that I love this first season of Star Trek because we get these hands in the pot that every episode is a new journey, even if the stories are somewhat similar, because this is very similar to the last episode. You get two Kirks, like, you know, we get a lot of these tropes real early on. It's like, oh, they're doing this again. It was still fresh. It was still different, you know, and that's the postmodern like love that Star Trek has, is that they could do the same story, change three elements, and it's completely new because it was groundbreaking.
And by the way, let's praise the Strange New Worlds writers once again, which is why SAG-AFTRA they need to be the writers need to be paid for this stuff to go
Absolutely.
back. We get
Solidarity.
I understand the Chapel thing like the Chapel thing in Stranger Worlds way better now because I've seen these episodes. Because you know, I still even in TOS, is she a nurse? Is she this elevator read? Like what is she really? And I feel like she kind of crosses over into several different medical disciplines in a sense, and maybe that just made it easy on the show. But I can, again, it makes the storyline Strange New Worlds. The word
That much better.
acceptable might be reaching a little bit, but it makes it more understandable. That's the way to say it. Now I get how they're setting her up. Go ahead, there, Bull.
I'm glad you brought up Chapel because this episode is it's one that features her, and it's always nice to see Majel Barrett in front of the camera. And it's funny because I think she does with her performance and her reactions, I think she backfills in some of the gaps in the writing, because again, and I said this before with her scene with Spock in The Naked Time, like they're still not quite reaching the finish line in developing like strong women characters. And I think the one thing that's missing in this particular storyline is that while Christine is horrified by what her fiance, Dr. Corby, has become, I did not get the emotional sense. I really wanted them to give her a showcase to be able to talk to the android, and they portrayed him, he was saying, "Can't you love me, Christine? I'm still, everything that you loved about me is just in this body." And there was an opportunity, and you would have gotten it in Strange New Worlds, by the way, just because we've evolved as a society and in our writing and everything like that. But I just, when you're looking back with the benefit of hindsight, you just wanted them to be able to, for her to be able to articulate her feelings, I guess, in a sense. And it's just kind of assumed or taken for granted, that she'd be revulsed and horrified by this, machinery or so forth. But you can imagine the possibilities if she had shown some tenderness, even though this was no longer the man that she loved, if you will. Like there was an opportunity there. And I don't think the episode suffers from not having it, but I see the opportunity, and you just wish, that there could have been a way. Because again, Majel Barrett is a strong actress playing that lane that's sort of professional, keeps her emotions bottled up, and we've seen that already in these earlier episodes. And so like I say, compared to the wild and freestyling Christine of the modern era, it's just interesting, right? I would have loved to have seen Christine and Corby have that one-on-one moment. Forget the plot, forget advancing the narrative. I would have liked to see that real emotion. I mean, that could have been devastating. I mean, and like I say, it doesn't harm the episode. It doesn't make it lesser. But there was a chance there to be like, wait a minute, can I love something that's just a facsimile, a copy, an echo of, whom I had hard feelings for?
Right, but again, I wonder if that's more because of a societal perspective, that the idea of man and machine somehow being in love, there's no way that would ever happen.
Right.
Or nowadays, would it really surprise us? I would argue that it would not surprise us if there is some, which is Battlestar Galactica, by the way, which we should just start a show to do that with the new Battlestar Galactica, so some of us can watch it. I'm pointing at
All right. Twist my arm.
It's so amazing, but they broached that subject a lot. And even recently we've seen movies. Wasn't there a movie with Joaquin Phoenix where he's in love with the computer? Her. Right, I think that's it. So the idea of falling in love with artificial intelligence makes you also question, which I've had this conversation a lot with my students about, what are we really, in a sense? I mean, are we just fleshy computers as it is, and were we programmed by something else? That's a Joe Rogan episode, or maybe
we're just meat puppets.
An extended pending rebrand episode. Yeah. I mean,
just meat puppets.
It makes you wonder those things.
And lest we forget that the Twilight Zone actually broached this subject, with the marooned on a planet, falls in love with the female robot, and the two men that come to retrieve him are like, "You can't love her; she's a robot." And then they go and kill her, and he's like devastated, and he wants to murder them. And this is not a new topic. I mean, this is one of those things that even Star Trek did not break entirely new ground here, but did kind of ignore that question in a way that's a little un-Roddenberry. And I think it's because they wanted to tell, and this is, I think, one of the few missteps of the original series of Star Trek, is they wanted to tell Kirk's story more than they wanted to tell Nurse Chapel's story. Even though Nurse Chapel is kind of the vehicle for this episode, how Kirk handles the situation is really what matters. And that's where, like, today's modern risk-taking type shows like Strange New Worlds are like, we don't need the captain to tell an episode. The original series really leaned heavily into, we need Kirk to tell these stories. These have to be Kirk stories. The thing that kind of annoys me about it is it really works. Like, it really works well, and I think if they'd gotten away with it, it would not have been successful, which is kind of the sad part, because we, through a modern lens, feel like they missed the boat here. But I think that the real testament, though, is that even though they missed the boat on that, it still feels like a great episode. Like, it still comes across as very, very successful. And that's really, again, the magic of Star Trek, is they don't have to do everything that the audience may want. And it still hits every single checkbox of, fine television. And that's the strength of this first season, is as klutzy as it may be at times, or as repetitive as it may feel, especially these early few episodes where they're kind of duplicating a lot of the same tropes. They're still successful. I mean, they're still delivering very quality television that's captivating. And part of the reason why they're allowed to get away with this duplication, which you could not do these days, is because there's no binge watching. If you miss an episode one week, it's not played again. You don't see it. You won't see it until it goes into syndication in, 1969, 70? So that's where they could get away with some of this stuff. They didn't have to hit every nuance. And, as much as we could criticize, because I think we certainly could, if you take that into account, it almost makes the show even better, which is something that it's unheard of these days. The only show I think that gets away with the same kind of duplication of tropes and stories is Law and Order SVU, because at some point you've told every rape and murder story that you can, and you have to just find different ways of combining it with current events. And it's just like, I don't know how that show's still on the air. I don't know why it's still enjoyable every time. The story is always the same. They have somehow diminished Ice-T to one line per episode. Hey, Captain, it's crime scene investigations. You want to take this call? And then he's gone. You couldn't do that with Bones McCoy. Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a crime scene investigator. And then he's not on the rest of the episode, and you're like, where is Bones? So I know I went off on a wild tangent there, but I just want to express, like, you won't see people 50 years removed going through Law and Order, examining that show the way you can do it with Star Trek. Because while that show is highly accomplished and deserves its accolades, it's never going to be as truly groundbreaking and inspirational as a Star Trek is.
Amen. And we should point out that Kirk, you're telling Kirk's story and how does he handle it? He does so by unleashing a racist tirade against Spock. So that was the solution there. And to Spock's credit, he didn't flinch, but he made sure to send down the security team, knowing that's not the Jim Kirk I know. So that was
right.
So, and I suppose he could have been much worse. After all, Cher recorded a #1 hit with Half-Breed, but that was enough to get his Vulcan senses tingling, and said something is amiss, and this is.
And that's not to cut you off there, but
No.
that's another thing about this episode that's truly powerful. I mean, especially of the era, civil rights movement. Lord Uther, I'm sure you could talk about this with your students. The fact that they are, in that moment, they are directly tackling a very apropos hush-hush thing. You really couldn't talk about this on television in such an open manner, where today, if you didn't talk about it, you would be a pariah.
Right.
They found an artful way, not to obfuscate, but to obscure just enough to make a pretty strong statement about, diction and how I'm trying to think of how I'm trying to articulate this, but how evolved a person can be in that they wouldn't lean into such baser, shall we say, tirades. You know, they may have some semblance of those thoughts, but they know better, and they know to separate those thoughts and say, you know what, that's faulty thinking. You know, and that Kirk is a much better person than that, because that wouldn't happen with the real Kirk.
Right.
That is, you know, I get chills just thinking about, like, at the time. I mean, you're talking, people were getting murdered over stuff like this, their race, and they're tackling this in a way that, I mean, I can only praise the art of it so much, but I could keep going for hours and hours because it's that poignant. And this is where I think television misses the mark today when they tackle big issues like this, is they tend to beat you over the head with the messaging, right? This was a very powerful, subtle punch at people who really were less evolved in their thinking, and painted this future utopia that I think Roddenberry was really trying to stress, that, like, things are going to get better. We will find harmony someday. There will be better relations amongst people. And it's that message of hope that's so deeply espoused to Star Trek that makes a moment like this just unquestionably powerful. And I think one of the reasons why an episode like this holds up so well is, to me, it feels so natural and so just like, yep, this is the future. Future is going to be more tolerant and better and more accepting and embracing. And kudos to Star Trek, because they've not let up on this gas pedal. You know, they are showing enlightened representation of all kinds these days. You still get a few, and I think this is modern writing to blame, but you still get a few preachy things on some of your Discovery episodes in particular, but you get a lot of nuance, and you get a lot of very artfully drawn out things that, you know, I love Star Trek for a lot of reasons, but one of it is that it assumes its consumer, whomever they may be, whatever age they may be, can think on a higher level. They don't need the SVU style beat the message into your head. And I deeply appreciate that, and I want to call it out, because writers, like those of the WGA, deserve fair compensation because they can trust their audience. Because I know what we're going to see as writing doesn't happen is these shelf projects are going to start getting made, and they are probably of a lesser quality writing. The scabs out there who want to make a quick buck are going to turn out some pretty terrible stuff. So please don't do it. Don't be a scab. Stand with the WGA, stand with SAG-AFTRA, and the United Auto Workers in their efforts to be fairly compensated, because, to tell you the truth, I don't mind paying Paramount Plus once a year for the content that I get. And I don't mind that Paramount Plus makes a lot of money. What I did mind is that they're not sharing it fairly with the people who've earned that. Writers included, actors included. Same thing with my vehicles. I would anticipate the people who put these together and deliver a quality product should get a fair wage that they deserve. Now, I will get off my soapbox, but it's very apropos to Star Trek because it's the future where everybody cooperates. And
Allegedly.
someday we'll get into how the Federation doesn't use money anymore, and yet they're still gambling.
Yeah.
With that, I think it's time we rate these episodes. 7 warp cores available to each. I gotta say, I'm really curious what Lord Uther thinks. So I'm going to kick you off here, Lord Uther. What do you have for us?
Excuse me. The first episode. I'd probably go. So that's Mud's Women, right?
Yes.
5 out of 7, and I'm not even going to base it off of kind of today's thought process. Maybe it wasn't actiony enough for me, or seemed like the episode maybe went a little too long. Maybe just the character itself. It's an okay character. But so I'm going to go 5 out of 7 there. Next episode, I'll go... Ooh. it's not a perfect episode. I'll go 6 out of 7. It's one that makes you think, maybe 6.5. Now I'll just go 6. Again, just something that makes you think. I appreciate the writers going backwards and obviously seeing this episode, which for Strange New Worlds and getting Chapel, that great backstory for that. The whole AI question, something I really dig. I don't know exactly what I feel is missing from it, but I can't give it 7 out of 7. I'm going 6. 6 out of 7. Let's see what Mr. McCaffrey thinks.
Well, I'm not going to tell you going into our Warp Core episode 32, I was giving these guys, but I will say thanks to your learned and astute analysis, my impressions of these episodes has elevated through our discussion. And I feel I'm going to be leaving this with a much stronger appreciation in certain regards, while still knowing of the things that we pointed out. He's just a little dizzy. So for Mud's Women, I too side with Lord Uther here. I think it's 5.
Of course you do.
I think it's a 5 now. And like I said, because I genuinely just, I had already formed an impression of Harcourt Fenton Mudd, and I liked that character, and I was anxious to see how he, the first trappings of him, and it for me, for this viewer, it never quite got to where I had originally set my expectations, I suppose. Now, he'll appear again, and when I see him in the animated show and all that, then it's a work in progress, let's say. But I did like the domestic scene there near the end, because that really was trying to, without having any of our principal characters on camera, we should point out, Kirk wasn't, although he and Mudd show up and try to mediate there at the end, the real interplay, the real back and forth, the real discovery is between the Miner and Eve, and even sometimes clumsily written, you can still see where they were going with it, and so that's the strength of that episode. For What Are Little Girls Made Of, I also agree that it's a 6, more for what it represents than necessarily everything that's in front of the camera. We've talked about the things that were a little silly, but I think for what it wants to say in that context, again, this is before droids in the Lucasfilm universe, and this is before, this is before HAL 9000 in Stanley Kubrick's seminal 2001, which I believe was 68. So we're 2 years away from that AI and its malevolence and so forth. So in a sense, they were really sort of, putting their feet into that pool of storytelling and science, where science meets technology. And I think you have to judge it on that framework. And I think that's what makes it provocative. I'm thinking more about the episode now, a few days after having screened it. And that's the sign of good drama, of good storytelling and so forth, where it can still sort of sit with you. It's not disposable. It's not the Expendables 4. It's something that makes you scratch your head and say, yeah, imagine the possibilities. And isn't that what Star Trek really has said all along? Imagine the possibilities. So let's go 5 and 6 for these two.
Love it. Love it. And I, ever the rosy Star Trek fangirl, will say 6 out of 7 warp cores for both episodes. Mudd's Women, I have to admit I'm a little partial to, because as much as I enjoy the actor who played Harry Mudd, I really have to say I always kind of picture Dom DeLuise in the role. And that just makes me enjoy it just a little bit more than I probably should. But it is that risk-taking scene where none of the principal characters of the show are on screen, and you get probably one of the finest performances of Star Trek in terms of the supporting guest characters, where they deliver, I think, the crux of the episode. You know, this changing of opinion, this sort of societal development where the misogyny kind of fades, and there's a realization there that there's something greater to a person than their appearance. And that, I mean, it feels very basic, very baser kind of writing. Almost, I mean, by today's standards, it's not even close to groundbreaking. Like, it's very much like, well, duh. And the thing I would say is, like, I look at it through the lens of the time. Like, that was huge for a television show to do. Like, this is pre All in the Family. This is pre Maude, and some of those shows that kind of really leaned into this quite a bit. I'm almost talking myself into a 7 here, but I would agree that it's not a perfect episode. And then What Little Girls Are Made Of, I've just always really loved that episode. Now, I'll be honest, the eye candy is probably what first got me into that episode.
Andrea.
You know, I was a young boy. You know, what can I say? You know, I don't want to make a generalization here, but I feel like there are many young men who watch this episode, and really that's all they remember was Andrea. I love the goofy, campy, let's spin Kirk in a circle. To piggyback off of Bull McCaffrey here, I always fall back to you're probably wondering why I'm here and why I have a picture of a burger on the wall. I can now hear, and I'm a little dizzy. Like, I love that episode for a few reasons, but Rook is really a hidden gem in that episode. And I didn't really talk about this at all, but I've always felt the menace of early Star Trek episodes started with Rook. That's the first time I ever felt like creeped out and a little afraid of a character. Even though he's not terribly intimidating and he's not like inherently evil, it's just like this is kind of creepy. Like in a way that hadn't been done yet on Star Trek at that time, and certainly, you know, becomes further characters. You know, I mean, they kind of did this with Where No Man Has Gone Before and with Charlie X, but it's something I think we see much later on, where a character is sort of on the surface and to the crew one way and completely another way behind the scenes, and that's where the red shirts die. You know, of course, you got that in the Man Trap too, but I really felt like Rook captured it in a way that when we get to the Corbomite maneuver, we'll probably discuss this more, but the whole like misdirection of character, I eat that up all the time. So 6 out of 7 for me too. But as we boldly go to future original series episodes, I would like to just remind everybody that here at Pending Rebrand, we are always putting out interesting and compelling content. So if you enjoyed this episode 32 of the Warp Core podcast, I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that share button. Let your friends know how good this was and or how bad it was. Drop us a comment. Where can we improve? What would you like to hear us talk about? Is there something we omitted from our analysis this episode? We're happy to read your comments on the next episode and address them. Likewise, in the future, we'll be doing live Warp Core podcasts, live Graying Jedi podcasts, live Cut the Cheese Poke the Bear podcast, and live Melt Off podcasts. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of that fun live content, because there's a darn good chance we may be watching Mud's Women on VHS in all its glory. And with that, I will say, live long and prosper.